Our guest this week is an independent researcher and writer focusing on libertarian philosophy and reformed theology, aimed at the educated layperson. That's us, by the way. Challenging readers to rethink prevailing paradigms in politics, theology, and culture. You can find more at her website, mereliberty.com. Kerry Baldwin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Alan.
Well, I told you right before we started the show that I had talked to my friend Mike Meharry, and I said, Mike, I want to talk about abortion and Christian nationalism on the show. Who should I get? And the first thing he said was, oh, such light and whimsical topics. I mean, practically anyone will do for such a lighthearted show as that. But he said, do you know Kerry Baldwin? And I said, I don't, but we can fix that. So, sad to say, you're now in the driver's seat to have to deal with these huge topics. But I want to start this off by sort of setting it up, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a second, is a question that I have asked basically every big guest I've ever had on the show is, what is the most recent, real, genuine change of heart that you've had on a big topic? You know, a political topic, a policy position. If you can't think of one, I don't even care if it's whether or not you like mashed potatoes. But what was the last big topic or most recent one you can think of where you thought, well, I used to believe this, and I weighed the arguments and I thought a lot about it, and I've had a genuine change of heart, and now I believe the opposite. What's a change of heart you've had?
Oh my gosh, I don't know what exactly my most recent one is, but I would say a significant one had to do with the use of the death penalty by the state.
Okay.
I used to be on the side of pro-death penalty, and not that I'm opposed to using lethal force. I'm not a pacifist, but in terms of using it as a punishment at the hands of the state, I think they're the wrong people to,
Sure.
to be in charge of that. So
sure, yeah. Well, that is a good answer. So I share a similar position as you do. That now don't get me wrong. As I sometimes kid to my friends trying to use language that won't get me deplatformed. I'm not going to lie to you. I think some people need to get got. With that said, I agree that I don't think the federal government should be the one making those decisions. But let me tell you one that I think is probably one of the biggest ones for me, and that is actually abortion. You know, I remember being a young man in college the first time, and so I'm 19, 20, 21 years old, and look, everybody around me is some level of pro-choice. There may be other students who self-identify as conservative, and they're still preaching that old safe, legal, and rare terminology that we all remember, because that totally turned out to be true. But really, at the end of the day, it was just how fervently they were willing to signal support for pro-choice. That's really what it boiled down to. And so when the argument was really just how pro-choice are you, then it was like, well, I guess to borrow from the comedian Louis C.K., it's that, well, abortion is wrong, but if you need one, you better get one. That's something that he's said before. But then as I got older, I started to think more along the lines of, well, and to borrow again from Louis C.K., even in his own stand-up where he said, those crazy people think that it's killing babies. And the audience laughs, and he kind of pauses and says, well, okay, maybe it's killing babies, and just the point, the point being is that he's like, well, it's, the longer you sit down to actually think about it, the more unsettling you may be, even with your own position on the topic. And that's how it was for me. I just kind of thought a lot about it, and I thought, well, I'm not going to sit here and say that it's a fun topic to think about, but it is what it is. I'm not going to hide from what it is anymore. And I had a complete 180 change on the subject. So is my experience in your mind, is my experience one that you think a lot of people share, or do you think a lot of people are stuck where I once was, which is, well, what level of pro-choice am I?
Yeah, I think most people I say are sort of caught in the middle. They're pro-life but or pro-choice but, right?
Hmm.
They understand some principle on both sides of the debate that maybe should be something that we should adhere to, like the right to life, or the fact that there should be a definitive way to identify when human rights start. And then on the other side is, a woman's bodily autonomy and agency. Does she actually get a choice in what she gets to, use her body for? But most people I find are in the middle. They're not willing to go all the way out to the extreme on either side, because the extreme on either side is abortion free for all, or lock all women up who seek out abortions. And most people understand, okay, this is a very complicated issue. And I know people who have gone and had abortions themselves, and they aren't like, they didn't have murderous intent. They had X, Y, and Z reasons why they did it. And that was a very difficult situation. Or on the other side is, I want to maintain my right to my body and my right to make decisions about my body and that sort of thing. So I think most people are sort of stuck in the middle.
Well, I guess let me tell you kind of what sort of inspired me to attack this topic today is there's certain right wing, I don't know what you want to call them, pundits, influencers. I'm not sure what terminology you want to use. I kind of refer to them as conservative Inc.
Yeah.
That consider the topic of abortion to be a dead end, no pun intended. So I use Mike Cernovich for example. He kind of considers, and he's been pretty public about this. He's really looking at the political expediency of pro-life, pro-choice, and he kind of feels that the right wing, by and large, politically should just drop it, and particularly more extreme positions of being pro-life. They should just drop it from the platform, because in his mind it's, well, every single election is the most important election. We have to win elections. Nothing matters if we don't win elections. Therefore, let's just drop these things for the fact of political expediency. So I guess this is sort of kind of like a little bit of a two-parter. Is that do you agree with him in his assessment that America by and large has just completely embraced abortion forevermore, and therefore conservatives should just sort of just kind of give it up? And then secondly, regardless of what your answer is of the first, what do you think that says about the supposed conservative movement if that's where they are? So, well, let's just give up things that we identify with in order to win elections.
Right. Well, I would say the problem with the conservative movement is, before the overturn of Roe v. Wade, Republicans could afford to have militant candidates, because there was really nothing that could have been done, from that very militant rhetoric, and they had a base of voters that they wanted to appeal to and ensure that they got those votes. And so when Roe v. Wade was overturned, it caught everybody by surprise.
Sure.
Nobody was expecting that. None of the Republicans were expecting that. And suddenly, a lot of the Republicans who had been elected or ran on a more militant pro-life stance suddenly had to put their money where their mouth was, and their supporters were expecting it. And I've watched Republicans backtrack on that, and say, okay, we've got to curtail the militancy. We've got to, we've got to get this messaging under control. And I think their first mistake was, letting militant pro-lifers kind of go off the rails whenever it suited them. That said, I'm not sure that the answer is just let it go. I do believe that's where the Republican Party is at this moment, is just let it go, because regardless of your stance, women are accustomed to having that option available if they're in a tight squeeze, and you're not going to get people aligned with, say, the abortion abolitionists who are like, nope, first-degree murder, and if the death penalty is an option, then so be it. Right? They are on a very extreme end of the spectrum where Americans just are not at. So, the Republicans are always going to do what's politically expedient. That's what makes them Republicans and now trying to conserve the status quo, right?
Sure.
So it's that tactic only works for so long. And really, it doesn't answer any sort of questions. It doesn't provide any sort of solutions. It doesn't establish when human rights begins. It doesn't affirm the rights of women. It doesn't do any of those things. It just sticks a Band-Aid on it and tucks it in the drawer and says, well, maybe this issue will go away, and it won't. So I'm a big fan of obviously taking a more libertarian approach to the idea, which is nuanced and challenges both sides.
Well, I will say this because I know you had kind of brought up, the more complicated facets of the topic, and maybe it's not just so simply black and white. But I know that you hear that phrase a lot, right? It's like, well, it's a complicated issue, and I don't mean to say that, oh, well, that's just a cop out, but I guess in some ways I've grown to kind of think that, because a lot of times when people use that phrase, oh, well, this is a complicated subject. Well, they don't mean to then expound upon it. They mean it as a dismissive thing. Well, let's not wrestle with this because it's just too much. I don't want to deal with this right now. Let's move that to the back burner. But it seems to me that anytime any subject gets labeled as too complicated or it's a complicated issue, and then it's sort of relegated to the back burner, then inevitably the Overton window just shifts a little bit further to the left, and I'm reminded, because the whole time you're talking right then about Republicans, it was reminding me of that I guess is Michael Malice quote of progressivism, or conservatism is just progressivism driving the speed limit.
Right. Yeah.
And them just defending the status quo. So I feel like that there is still a certain amount of right wing identifying people in the country that would say, well, the problem with Republicans is not to get into the whole rhino debate, or the problem with Republicans, the problem with conservatives at large, is that they're not actually conservative. Take pro-life, or take education. Not that long ago, historically, the position was abolish the Department of Education. Now it's, well, how much money do we need to give, the teachers unions in order to get them to leave us alone? Well, so it seems like those issues, if they're not resolved, just ultimately go left.
Yeah, well, the Republicans have gotten into the habit of being pragmaticists, right? They stopped believing that they had a platform of principles that were worth fighting for. So that's a major part of the problem, is they need to be pragmatic. That's sort of where the incrementalism comes in. Okay, we're never going to overturn Roe, so how can we make it more difficult for women to obtain abortions? Well, that's a pragmatic standpoint. That's not a principled standpoint. And, when I talk about it being a complicated issue, part of the reason why I'm pointing that out is because, we're seeking out the state for a solution to a problem that is multifaceted. And quite frankly, is multifaceted in the sense that the state shouldn't be involved in it in various other ways, right? Like the economic aspect of it, the philosophical aspect of it. We shouldn't have the state defining when personhood begins, for example. And the economic aspect, which I think is probably one of the most important pieces, is heavily and negatively influenced by what the government is doing, and the fact that it is, has injected itself into every aspect of our lives. So, and not to mention the moment, and people know this intuitively, the moment that you start talking about abortion being murder and therefore should be criminal, what do you do with abortive mothers? You look at our current criminal justice system and you go, man, I wouldn't put a mother through that. And that shouldn't be baptizing abortion as, well, I guess that's what we have to leave it at. That should be challenging us to take a look at our criminal justice system and the inherent injustices that are in that system. So that's what I mean by complicated. It's a multifaceted issue. I do believe it can be solved, but it's never going to be solved by being pragmatic and expedient.
Well, a couple more quick things before we take our first break. So you had already mentioned, the overturn of Roe. Thankful the judicial temple monkeys at the Supreme Court decided to rule on that. But I think, talking about, since we're really kind of on the right wingers right now, and who better, right? But I think what happened a lot, or what a lot of people, I believe, feared. I remember, I mean, you could look at the decades before the overturn, where a lot of people's complaints were, well, the Republicans at the federal level don't really want it overturned because it's good for fundraising, right? I can run on that on
Mhm.
my platform, and oh well, I know we have majorities on the court and in the executive and judicial and legislative branches, but gosh darn it, we just can't seem to get anything done. Funny how that works.
Right.
And now that something was done, I feel kind of an equal and opposite thing has happened, which is, here we go. We're wiping our hands of it. Mission accomplished. Hang the banner, as George Bush did. We're out of here.
Yep.
We've saved civilization. But I'm not so sure the battle is over, is it, Kerry?
No, the battle's not over, and I can tell you for a fact that what Republicans are looking at doing is codifying Roe v. Wade. What Roe v. Wade did, separate from Planned Parenthood versus Casey, is that it established that abortion was legally permissible up to viability. And neither the Republicans nor the Democrats believe that a country where Roe v. Wade is overturned and the states are just, sort of floundering to figure out what to do with that. None of them believes that that's a good solution to the problem. And arguably it isn't, especially if, there are questions about whether, a woman from Texas where it's illegal to have an abortion, can come over to New Mexico and have a legal abortion. And should she be charged with a crime when she goes back to Texas? So Republicans have to do something, and they are talking about going along with this idea of codifying Roe into law, which is a completely different scenario than what we had with just this case with Roe v. Wade.
Leave it up to Republicans, particularly at the national level, to have the courts actually side with sending something back to the states. And what do they want to do? Take it right back to Washington,
Create a
D.C.
federal law.
Yeah.
Yep.
One more thing on abortion before we take a commercial break. So I showed this to you earlier. Of course, what's the libertarian position on abortion? I do have to say really quick, looking at that graphic, I've been very vocal on this program that I despise anyone ever going on a podcast and saying, well, gather around, children, let me tell you what the libertarian position is on X. Because I tell people, look, I'm not King Libertarian. I don't write down what the libertarian positions are. And funny enough, and your debate with Walter Block is illustrative of this. So we've talked a lot about conservatives. Let's talk about our favorite short bus kids, the libertarians. So libertarians, being known as principled and logically consistent as folks can be, at least self-described, and yet you still have wildly varying views on this topic just amongst libertarians. How is that possible?
Well, okay, so this is a very good question. And when the Libertarian Party was taken over by the Mises Caucus, what was that, 2022?
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and they removed the abortion plank from the platform. I wrote an article talking about the history of the abortion issue in the Libertarian Party. So most people are under the impression that the Libertarian position is defaulted to pro-choice. Obviously, keep the government out of our bedrooms, right? And that's actually not the case. The Libertarian Party has always been split about 3 different ways on the topic of abortion, and really equally. You had the pro-choice people, but you also had the pro-life people. And, the argument there was very simple, very simple. If our rights come from our own humanity, just existing as humans, then that should extend to the unborn baby as well. Because science definitively demonstrates that a new human life begins from the moment conception is complete. Now, there's all kinds of debates about quote unquote personhood. I have another article about that. But the point is that the Libertarian Party was never in agreement on it. And so that platform went through, or the plank of the platform went through a number of changes, I would say with the best of intentions of trying to represent both sides. But at the end of the day, we have to ask a question. If our human rights are objective, right? They exist whether somebody else acknowledges them or not. They do not come from government. They do not come from another person. They simply come from our existing as human beings. Then there's a definitive yes or no answer to this question. And it should be answered definitively yes or no. The unborn has rights, yes or no. And there should be a logical explanation as to why. And so that's sort of where we're at right now. The Libertarian Party and libertarians generally do not have a consensus on this. And I take some great pains to explain why that is so. But that doesn't mean that we can't come to a definitive conclusion. And quite frankly, I think that the integrity of libertarianism actually depends upon coming to a definitive conclusion on it.
Well, I really appreciate that explanation. I think something that I've told people, and I certainly didn't invent the wheel, is that it's very common for the public at large, in any group, even libertarians, to throw up their hands and say, well, if I don't have a concrete answer, then I'm just going, I hate to use the phrase status quo, but I'm going to defer to that, whatever we're currently doing, whatever is. But I'm reminded of the phrase, just because something has been doesn't mean it need always be. Think of all the things that were, one day were decided to be, incurable, unquestionable, and then suddenly a cure is found, a question is solved. Right. On that note, well, Kerry, I think you did a fantastic job talking about abortion. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and then you're going to knock out Christian nationalism. How about that? Great. Kerry, what is Christian nationalism?
A dumpster fire.
All right, well, that's all the time we have today. Yeah.
So Christian nationalism is interesting because there's a number of proposals that have sort of been put forward by a number of people currently as to what Christian nationalism is. And this has ranged everywhere from, is this a nation of Christians who hold to Judeo-Christian values, and we want that to sort of be the dominant view of the culture? And then you've got the more, again, I'm going to use the word militant, nationalists who believe that the government should actually be enforcing Christian values, not just in terms of thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not steal, but also in terms of, don't covet, or, you can't practice your non-Christian faith in public, or things like that. So there's some ranges there. And some of them, not all of them, do have, unfortunately, a racialist component, which involves this accusation. And I think it's quite grounded for some of them that they are white supremacists. It's not true of all of them. Not everybody who says that they're a Christian nationalist, believes that the white race is superior, or, that the government should be establishing religion, Christian religion in particular. But, really what it is Christians are, Christians are remembering back to, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, where you had a sort of dominant Christian sentiment. It was assumed that you were Christian unless otherwise, self-identified as something else. But that's sort of the idea of what Christian nationalism is.
Well, I think, because I know it's a really complex subject that we're trying to distill into like a 5 or 10 minute window.
Right.
But and of course, it's obviously, we would never say on this show that one race was superior to another. Of course, it's men right. who are superior. But with that said, because some people would say, America is America a Christian nation? Because I think that those aren't necessarily the same question. And before you answer that, because I know that that's kind of a really broad generalization question too, is that a good friend of mine who is much more of a theologian than I am, had brought up the topic of, well, what's Christianity? Like, we were just talking about libertarians that are these deeply principled, logically consistent people, and yet they have wildly varying views on some pretty major topics. Well, I know that there's a lot of Christians out there that have wildly varying views on their own faith and on the way society should be run, or in anything in the middle. So if you're going to have a Christian nation, well, whose Christianity, who's writing the rule book on which we're going to prescribe that into law? Which Christians are we using as the guiding star to dictate how we're going to, do things from a civic standpoint? Because I'll be honest with you, I hate to name names on this program, but I know a lot of people. We talked about Conservative Inc. in the first segment. I know a lot of people that wear that label on their chest or on their sleeve, and I consider them some pretty abhorrent people between you and me. So which Christianity are we talking about? Is America a Christian nation?
Well, okay, so that's the major problem, right? Is it Protestant or Catholic? Is it Trinitarian or non-Trinitarian? Is it evangelical or mainline? And even within evangelicalism, I want to point this out because I think it's an important data point. Of those who describe themselves as quote unquote American evangelical, half of them are nominal, which means in name only, which means that they don't actually hold to the tenets of Christianity. It's just sort of what their parents were, self-identified as, and so it's a very superficial level. So yeah, obviously the very first question is which version of Christianity are we talking about, so to speak? And does that mean, if it's a Trinitarian Christian who's in office, does that mean that, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and those sects are, now unwelcome in America or have to stop practicing their faith? Like, exactly to what extent are we talking about? Protestants and Catholics, I mean, we can go back 500 years to that, to that fight. Do we need to keep that fight up? And quite frankly, there are some of us who are Reformed Christians who believe that the Christian position is actually religious pluralism, which is, as far as legality is concerned, that, the Christian position is legal pluralism. So there's there's nothing definitive when we say, quote unquote, Christian nation. And I'll just add, the question about whether or not it's a nation is also at issue, because the biblical idea of a nation is, basically a large tribe. It's people who are literally from the same ethnic roots. And the United States of America has people of all walks of life, all ethnic roots. And so you can argue that we're not even a nation as such. So very, very difficult problems in actually getting down to brass tacks when you're trying to define whether or not we're a Christian nation.
Well, Kerry, I'm from Tennessee, so you don't have to sell me on that note. I already consider my nation to be under occupation by the United States. So that being neither here nor there, we're running short on time, and we've made it all this way, and heck, we didn't even talk about Israel and Palestine. So I mean, I feel like you practically got off pretty easy today. But we'll end on, well, this will be the next to last one because you get a fun question at the end.
Okay.
So I think as it pertains to the Christian nationalism perspective, because you have sort of your America firsters, right? You have your and look, I'll be happy to admit that a lot of Western civilization has a foundation in theology and in Christian values, and I know that of course Christianity is a prevalent religion in in the United States. And of course, there's a lot of America firsters who would identify as Christian. So I'm not hiding from any of those facts. But I think you have your America firster types, and they would consider themselves to be deeply religious Christian. And then you have your more kind of modern conservative movement Republican types who, again, they're going to identify overwhelmingly as Christian. Of course, you would have your libertarian / anarchist types. My good friend Stephen Rose with Anarcho-Christian, who would say that, well, I read a lot more of anarchism out of the Bible than any of this adherence to a worldly nation. But those are wildly, again, so those are wildly different positions. And the only reason I even made the quip about Israel and Palestine is that, again, and I got to tell you, between the right and the left, I mean, I guess I'm closer to the right than I am the left, but I hate the right more. And I'll tell you why I hate the right more. It's because the left doesn't lie to me about who they are. They say that that they don't represent me in any meaningful sense, and they don't intend to. The right does say that they represent me, but they don't intend to. That's why I don't like them. I shouldn't use the word hate, but I dislike them even more.
Yeah.
It seems to me that a lot of the same kind of people that have a lot of influence in politics and media, that identify, at least publicly, as right-wing or conservative, that may even label themselves as America First and Christian nationalists, are totally in the tank for a foreign nation whose interests don't seem to align with the United States. Why is that?
Well,
I know that's such a very simple question, but yeah, go ahead.
Such a very simple question. I can say very quickly that really what that boils down to is a big $20 word called eschatology, which is the varying views in Christianity about what the quote unquote end times will look like. And a major question is, what role does Israel, the nation state of Israel, play, if any role at all, in the in end times apocalyptic prophecies? And those aren't in agreement. And without even realizing it, you're seeing that play out in these debates about, Israel and Gaza and Palestine. And quite frankly, the left has it too. The left also has a view about eschatology and the end times, which is playing into their own views on it. And nobody's talking about it in those terms because they all automatically assume, I shouldn't say all, but most of them automatically assume that all Christians have the same view of the end times. And we don't. There's different views about that.
How convenient it is! Isn't democracy wonderful? That all the political leaders on any ballot that you can vote for in this country all seem to have the same view when it comes to some of these key issues.
Right.
On that note, Kerry, where can people go to support you and get more of your content?
Yes, you can find all my work on mereliberty.com. I have my own podcast, Dare to Think, which you can find on there, and also any podcatcher. I also teach courses in critical thinking online, and will be opening up registration for that in the next few weeks.
Well, I don't know if I can endorse that, because the more I critically think, the more upset I get. So I'm trying to lower my blood pressure these days. Kerry, we're going to get you out of here on this one. Are you ready for the bonus round?
Okay, I'm ready for the bonus.
If you have 2 lasagnas and you stack one lasagna on top of the other, is it still 2 lasagnas, or just now simply a lasagna?
I'm going to have to go with just a lasagna.
That is correct. It now just becomes a single lasagna. Well done, Kerry. I'm not gonna tell you the absolute frauds who have been on the show that have a losing record when it comes to the food quiz, but you are currently 1-0. Kerry Baldwin, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on. This was fun.